Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General of the IEA. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for the launch of our Tax and Growth research paper. It's great to see you. We were set just over a year ago quite a challenging essay question, really, which is if you wanted to construct a tax and spending system that would maximise economic growth, what would it look like? And how would it differ from the present tax and spending system that prevails in the United Kingdom? And what lessons do we have to learn from the recent history of the United Kingdom? And I hope that today we will be launching, and beyond today, spreading something of an antidote to the prevailing meme that government spending must remain extraordinarily high and we can't afford to cut back on it. The conclusions of this excellent report point very, very strongly indeed in the opposite direction, and I look forward greatly to Philip Hammond adopting all of our recommendations at the autumn statement later this month. Just to give you an introduction and a flavour before we hear from our distinguished speakers this evening about some of the issues, some of the stats that we discovered in our research, I'm going to play you a short video that will introduce you to some of the thoughts and indeed some of the conclusions that the IEA discovered.
Amidst all the heat that has been generated about austerity, a number of important debates in public finance have been sidelined.
All the focus has been on small reductions to government spending, which have only been designed to reduce the government's borrowing requirements.
We've lacked any real discussion about what the size of the state should be, or whether spending should be reduced, not just so that we live within our means, but in order to reduce the long-term burden of taxation.
It's time to set the record straight on austerity and what excessive government spending means for taxpayers. That's why the Institute of Economic Affairs has produced this major study on government spending, taxation and economic growth.
This study starts by tracing the growth of the size of the state over the last 100 years.
We find that taxation and government spending as a proportion of GDP have increased dramatically since World War I. Though the official statistics put it a little lower, our findings suggest that government spending as a proportion of GDP has increased from about 1/8 to around 45% today.
The government is spending nearly half our national income. It's no wonder the government is unable to finance its spending through taxation, and that we have such a chronic deficit.
Also, contrary to popular belief, the numbers reveal that there has not been a significant reduction in government spending since 2010.
Despite all the hype around austerity these past few years, real spending actually only fell by 0.5% per year over the last Parliament, and is planned to actually increase through to 2020.
Our government spending is considerably higher than in countries such as Australia or Switzerland, in both of which there are similar or better levels of welfare for their citizens.
This extreme level of government consumption spending has a tendency to harm growth, and the taxation required to finance it can spell disaster.
Reducing the size and growth rate of the economy.
Reducing incentives to save, invest and innovate.
And distorting economic decisions and deterring transactions.
A better tax system can be created.
One that would lead to income gains right across the income distribution, but most significantly to the poorest.
But in order to see these gains, the government will have to cease its spending spree, reduce government spending and produce a more rational tax system. This will improve employment, productivity and wage growth too.
It's time for an honest discussion about taxation and spending levels.
This Tax and Growth project is the first step towards that goal.
To learn more about the history of government spending, taxation and its impact on economic growth, visit our website at iea.org.uk.
So I hope that's given you a flavour of what we were investigating and some of our findings. But to tell you a little bit more about it, I'm delighted to introduce and please welcome the man who has overseen this amongst many myriad of other IEA research projects over the years, the Academic and Research Director of the IEA, Professor Philip Booth. Philip.
Thank you, Mark. Well, that's the first time I've seen that video, in fact, which puts me in a slightly awkward position because I was about to say almost exactly what you've just seen in the video. But I'll say it in slightly different words and with a slightly different emphasis, perhaps. But before I do that, perhaps I can just pay tribute to the authors, I think most of whom are here, David Smith, Ryan Bourne, Lucy Minford, Rory Meakin, and Patrick Minford. They all delivered on time. They all patiently dealt with my editing, and in the end they played their part in ensuring that a project which has been going on for 540 days was delivered with one working day to spare. So what did the authors tell us? Well, as I say, you've seen one version of that. Well, firstly, that government spending has grown from 10% of national income to its current level of 46% of national income in the last 100 years. And this is way above the welfare maximising level of government spending and probably greater than the government can sustainably raise in taxes over the long term. Hence the chronic deficit that we have despite George Osborne's efforts to close it. Of course, we have austerity. Well, not quite, as you've just heard. Whilst many households have been pulling in the purse strings very tightly since 2008, the government has cut spending by just 0.5% per annum in the period 2010 to 2015, and it actually intends to increase spending in real terms in the next 5 years. What the BBC calls austerity, or on one occasion taking us back to the era of the road to Wigan Pier, is actually a set of political choices that the government has made to cut spending in some areas and increase it in others. And overall, the research shows that there's a very strong relationship between taxation and growth. So, for example, if we were to reduce spending and in the long-term taxes in the UK to the level that they have in that neoliberal anarchic hellhole called Australia, that is by 10 percentage points of national income, we might expect growth to rise by 1% per annum, which is a huge increase. Indeed, I was listening to Ken Loach, not for too long. I switched to another channel quite quickly, actually, on Thursday night, and he was talking about the great change from the 1960s to the current time in terms of how the government thought about welfare and government spending. Well, actually, at the beginning of the 1960s, government spending was only 30% of national income. Today, it's 46% of national income. But facts don't really fit into the script of Ken Loach's work all that well. Now, the research that we've covered in terms of tax and growth is not entirely robust in determining that it's actually low taxes and low government spending which cause increases in growth. So our authors did further work, and that further work suggests that decreasing the top marginal rate of tax and decreasing labour market regulation, which very often regulation is a substitute for taxation, would have a similar effect on economic growth as the older literature which we reviewed and which was not able to find a sort of causal link. So the new research that we did essentially confirmed the result of the previous research, which was perhaps less robust. Now, finally, we asked the question, if we wanted to design a tax system to raise the sort of money that a government might wish to raise if it reduced government spending to welfare maximising levels, would it keep the current system with its 17,000-page tax code, or should we make our tax code closer to Hong Kong's 276 pages? Actually, we didn't quite put the question that way, but that sounds better rhetorically. And we proposed a tax death list of 20 taxes and suggested that the government should focus its efforts on raising about 25 to 30% of GDP through 3 taxes, basically a consumption tax, an income tax, and a tax on land values and the imputed rental income from property. And if you had these huge tax cuts that this would imply, it would actually be the poorest 2 deciles of the income distribution that would gain more, that would gain most. So is there any good news in the research, I hear you asking? Well, of course there is. The government is spending 46% of national income. Just imagine if the government were ruthlessly efficient. Just imagine how unbearable life would be if we got all the government that we paid for. Thank goodness we don't.
Philip, thank you so much for that overview. Of course, the role of the IEA is to push the envelope. It's to think the unthinkable, and it is to challenge the political consensus and prevailing thinking, not to adapt to it. But ultimately, if we want policy change, we obviously need to work with politicians. And so our next speaker is a great friend of free market capitalism, a great friend of the IEA. So please join me in welcoming to the stage the Right Honourable John Redwood MP.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a great report in terms of length. The IEA haven't taken their own advice to keep things slimline and simple. And the report will certainly be challenging to myself and to fellow MPs. We are in a situation where we will need to spend more on schools and teachers, on hospitals, surgeries, nurses, doctors. People expect high-quality services, and we know that it's going to take more money to do it. So when it comes to spending, we have to proceed with common sense and with decency. I think the two big areas for saving that we will be looking at is, firstly, we will, of course, soon, I hope, make a major saving by no longer having to pay for that additional government in Brussels and saving those net contributions, which some of us have been working on in recent years, is around the corner, and that will be very useful money. And the second huge area, which the predecessor government and this one are trying to tackle, is the great topic of welfare. And I have no wish to reduce welfare by reducing the payments to the disabled. If anything, I don't think they get enough, and we need to be decent. But what we do need to do is to strain every sinew, as I think this government will do, to get more and more people into work so that they are paid more and paid better, and they need less welfare as a result. And that surely is the big challenge, which will reduce that percentage of state activity, make people better off, and give them worthwhile things to do. So that is a big challenge. And where I love the work of the IEA in this and other publications is on the tax side. I think the best tax is a tax that you repeal. And if you can't do that, because you do need some taxes to pay for these great things, then it needs to be simple, and it needs to have a rate which is realistic. And where I and the IEA are very much in agreement is that if you put the rate up too much, far from raising more money, you raise less money. And it can happen in two ways. There's the indirect way, that if you take too much money off people, they pay the tax, they can't spend the money in other ways, so you lose all the other consequential tax revenue you would have collected if that money had percolated through the system. But sometimes politicians are stupid enough to put the tax rate up so that you actually get less money from that individual tax. And we've got a number of those areas still in Britain today where the tax rate is set way above what I think would be the profit maximising rate. So surely, Chancellor, that's something you could take up. Predecessor George Osborne was the first person to admit from the Treasury bench that there was something called the Laffer effect, that you could actually have a rate that was too high. His then advisors, I think, made him believe that the optimum rate was still an awful lot higher than it truly is. So I hope that together we can get chancellors to review all that. And I also think tax reform can proceed in two ways. One, just get rid of some of the smaller fiddly taxes. When we had a Conservative government in the 1980s, chancellors used to proudly say every budget they would scrap a tax. It's a very good thing to do. And the other thing is to take some of those big taxes head on and see if we can simplify the way they're levied, the way they're collected, the number of rates they have, the number of complications for the offsets and the qualifications. We do have a dog's breakfast of a tax system where a lot of very clever lawyers and legislators have got to work trying to stop loophole after loophole and often creating new loopholes. So maybe flatter is fairer, maybe more comprehensive is fairer. And that, I think, is one of the big messages you've given us. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have this great opportunity. There is now a new Conservative government, a new Conservative Prime Minister, a new Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer. They've said they want people to have more and better work, better paid jobs. They want them to keep more of the income they earned. To do that, we need to strip away some of the taxes on enterprise and effort. We believe in reward, in success, in enterprise, so why do we tax it so much? And surely, above all, we must be able to persuade this government that some tax rates are simply so high that you collect less revenue, an absurd way to proceed. So good luck to the IEA. Thank you very much for, yet again, challenging us all. I will take up some of those challenges, but not every one of them, because I know otherwise what my Labour critics would say if I endorsed your full report. Thank you very much.
John, thank you so much, and thanks in particular for joining us when I know you're on an incredibly tight schedule this evening, and particularly between balancing the importance of principle with the art of the possible. We're extremely grateful to you. Our next contribution comes from Iain Martin, editor and founder of Reaction, an online commentary and analysis website, former editor of The Scotsman, well-known journalist, great columnist, author of Making It Happen, Fred Goodwin, RBS, and the Men Who Blew Up the British Economy, and the upcoming Crash Bang Wallop, the inside story of the Big Bang and the financial revolution that changed the world. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Iain Martin.
Thank you very much. I found myself, it's a career first, I'm actually endorsing more of this report than John Redwood, which gives one pause for thought. But firstly, can I begin just by praising and commending the authors of this publication. It is, I don't agree with every word in it and every recommendation, but it is incredibly clear-sighted, lucid, and a very, very impressive piece of work. It's also timely. I think it's timely because there's a tendency at the moment in this Westminster bubble to think that absolutely everything must be about Brexit negotiations. And we know that that's simply not the case. You even take something like foreign affairs, Russian aggression in the Baltic states. Western Europe may soon find itself under even more pressure in the guise of President Trump. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? You might need an extra sort of appendix on increases in defense spending at some point in the next few years. But as this study makes brilliantly clear, there is a ton of work to be done on fixing Britain's dysfunctional tax system, and that goes well beyond Brexit. The system is far too complex, there are too many taxes, and the incentives offered are very often downright perverse. Now, how has this happened? I don't propose to rehearse and repeat every aspect of the story of Conservative Party tax policy since 2000 or 2005, when the story probably begins with the election of David Cameron. And if you remember, actually go back, there was a tax commission chaired by Lord Forsyth, a friend of mine, very ably chaired, and that was published 10 years ago. And George Osborne welcomed it. I mean, he actually had no choice because it was a Conservative Party document, and he had to sit on the stage and commit to lower, flatter, fairer taxes with his fingers crossed. But the message of the Forsyth Commission went unheeded, and that message was very clear that the UK needed lower, flatter, simpler taxes to boost investment, to boost economic activity, wealth creation, and to increase prosperity. Why was it unheeded? It was unheeded principally because of the crash, or it was principally because it was pre-crash, rather. And tax reports were fuddy-duddy stuff, not in tune with the Tory modernising zeitgeist. And that turns out to have been a terrible mistake, because then when the crash happened and the Tory modernisers were thrust into office, it turned out that tax reform was no part of their plan. And they were operating in very difficult circumstances, but essentially their response on tax was inherently piecemeal and hardly ever coherent. The result for Britain, after 6 years of David Cameron's government now over, We are where we are on taxation in this country, and there needs to be dramatic change. This report should and deserves to act as a catalyst for an entirely new conversation about how we can overhaul our tax system. One note of caution and one note of encouragement in terms of turning this into policy. Firstly, the Prime Minister is, rather troublingly, not particularly interested in these themes, and it's unclear whether she's particularly interested in economics, full stop, which could be a problem. The Chancellor is very much interested in these themes and persuadable, but busy on several fronts, which makes it even more important that this message is delivered loudly and clearly and explained in the terms that the IEA explains it brilliantly in this report. And the point must be that tax reform is not incidental to Britain's prosperity post-Brexit. It will, if it is transacted, be absolutely pivotal to making Britain flourish outside the EU. But once again, Mark, congratulations. Fantastic report, a very impressive piece of work. Thank you very much.
Iain, thank you for your kind words. Last but by no means least, I'd like to welcome to the stage James Cleverly MP. James is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Braintree, the convener of the Free Enterprise Group of Conservative MPs in Parliament, promoting market economics within the Conservative Parliamentary Party. James mentioned to me today, although he had not quite had the opportunity to read and reread the entire report cover to cover, he had been asked his thoughts about it by the Daily Mirror and the Daily Telegraph. To share the thoughts that he passed on to the Daily Mirror and the Daily Telegraph and his overall thoughts about the proposition we've made, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage James Cleverly MP.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I have a copy of the report here, and if anyone were to accuse the various authors and the IEA of skating over this subject or giving it a bit of a cursory glance before putting pen to paper, I think the 226 pages of well-researched, well-argued and well-evidenced information in this book would show that to be a lie. And actually, I'm going to take Mark to task with what he said there, because, and this may surprise some of you, and indeed some of you may not believe this, I have read every single word of the executive summary. Yeah, go on. Thank you. I've been working all night on that gag. I don't expect another one, okay? But I'm a Conservative MP, and my instincts draw me to believe that taxes should be as low as possible while still discharging their fundamental duty of raising money for governments to do the things that governments need to and want to do. But as a politician, I'm also conscious that there is a difficulty when you are trying to sell an idea that is perhaps both counterintuitive and also reinforcing a stereotype, perhaps even a negative stereotype about the Conservative Party. So when Conservatives, as John Redwood, who has had to leave us, when Conservatives who have stood up for years and years and years and said what I think people who subscribe to the idea of liberal free market economics know in their heart of hearts, that lower rates of tax can generate higher levels of tax. When we say this, it's not enough just to repeat it as a mantra. We need to say it with passion. And also we need to be able to evidence it. And I think it is going to be a very, very useful piece of work. This report is going to be a very, very useful piece of work for politicians in the next few years and perhaps beyond, to be able to turn to pages of this book, of this report, and say, look, here is the maths. This is not some kind of loose philosophical exercise. This is well-evidenced hard maths, which shows that you can reduce the tax rate on businesses and individuals, and in doing so, maximise the amount of revenue that a government can draw in. If at the same time you can impose a degree of self-discipline on government, that takes us to the sweet spot, which, irrespective of our political allegiances, I suspect we all want to get to, which is taking no more money out of the pockets of businesses and individuals than we really need, supporting the people that we need to support, and John mentioned those people with ill health, with disabilities, people around the globe that have been the recipients of natural or man-made disasters, all the things that instinctively we want to do, those moral imperatives. Having the money to do all those things, and yet simultaneously giving people the financial liberty and therefore the total liberty to do what they want to do with their lives, which is someone on the perhaps more libertarian wing of my party, I think also is a good thing. So, Mark, I'm going to gloss over you because I don't see your name anywhere on the front. But to Philip, who edited it, to Ryan, to Rory, to Lucy, to Patrick, and to David, who did all the heavy lifting on this, thank you. Thank you very, very much, because I think you have, in this book, created a space where traditional low-tax Tories like myself, you've created a space where we can think, where we can manoeuvre, and where we can make the case for a reduction in the tax burden, but also reinforce the fact that that does not mean that we are shying away from our moral duty to the poorest and most disadvantaged in society, and also creating a country where people can live the lives that they want to lead. So thank you very, very much.
James, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thanks to all of our speakers, Philip, Iain, John in his absence, and James. Thanks again to our authors. Particular thanks to our donors. This was an extensive piece of work, and we're incredibly grateful for those who donate money to the IEA to make projects, launches, events like this possible. And we see this as a bit of a start of the process. We've completed the research, we've press released the research, it is now public. I hope you will be able to read about it in tomorrow's papers. But we are determined to continue to push forward these messages. So if you have given money to the IEA, thank you very much. It's only your generosity that makes these things possible. Last thing for me to say is we still have the room for another 45 minutes. So thanks to the generosity of our donors, you can recharge your glasses. If you have not yet read the report or don't have a copy, there are plenty over there. And with James in mind, we have also produced a particular thin James Cleverly version of the report, which you can read everything, including the references, in a mere 34 pages of A5, James. So if you have James's attention span and time poverty, then the shorter report is the document for you. Thanks to all of those who's contributed. Thanks for being with us tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much indeed.